will the government's borrowing plans spook the market? Should a former neo-Nazi take part in electoral politics? And do British grandmothers deserve more respect? With me today is the Times columnist Sonia Soda. Welcome to the show, Sonia.
Hi there, Ed.
And the Sunday Times associate editor, Josh Glancy. Hello, Josh.
Good morning.
Let's get deep into complicated economics on which all three of us are massive experts. The Times front page story today about the government's plan to use a change in the fiscal rules to borrow an extra $9 billion a year to spend on infrastructure, housing and support for businesses. The Chancellor's hoping it will allow him to have something positive to announce in his budget, which is just a mere 2.5 months away. John Healey thinks the extra funding can get the economy moving if it's spent the right way. This has been telegraphed, Josh, quite a bit. It was Jim O'Neill, the famous sort of Goldman Sachs banker who now helps our governments, whether they're Labour or Conservative. Is John Healey going to get away with this?
Yes, I think probably. Rachel Reeves changed the fiscal rules and she created these the ability to spend more on what they call puffins. And I think you're going to hear a lot more of this word puffin, which is a public finance institution, basically.
Okay.
And that's what they call them. So things like the National Wealth Fund or the British Business Bank.
Oh, yes.
And the idea is that if you can show that you're investing in infrastructure that will bring returns further down the line, you can justify more borrowing. There's no indication. I mean, the bond market's been pretty mute in response to Burnham's premiership thus far. And there's no indication that we're on the cusp of some sort of Liz Truss-style disaster. But there will be grumblings, I think, that there is just an intention to spend and not much of a conversation about economic growth, which doesn't seem to have been a sort of clear priority from Burnham thus far. So I do think the broader scepticism over where's the growth going to come from to pay for all this government spending remains. But I think these structures they've created with these puffins will allow them to spend a few more billion. And that's something that, as you say, Jim O'Neill and others have been telegraphing for a while, that there's flex in the system. Yeah,
it's an odd number, 9 billion. They've obviously worked it out quite carefully. But some people say if you're going to go down this road, it's actually not enough, Sonia. You should be spending more if you're going to really kickstart the economy.
Well, I suspect this number comes from looking at how much headroom there is, and some of it will probably be people around the government speculating rather than any sort of position arrived at by the government. I think we'll have to wait for the budget on that. Yeah, you're absolutely right that £9 billion of investment is not loads when you're talking about kickstarting the economy. The key question will be, though, to what extent is this money being invested on behalf of the government through mechanisms like, a National Wealth Fund, for example, or a National Housing Bank, into things that generate a guaranteed revenue stream for the government. Because if you're investing in things like building houses that are going to be rented, that generate a guaranteed income stream, that is not going to push the cost of borrowing up and could help kickstart the economy through impact on the construction industry, for example, and on the wider impact in terms of the cost of renting. So the devil is in the detail, but I cannot believe that the government would be embarking on schemes that they think the markets will sort of take into signal to push up the cost of borrowing. So I think it is going to be spending that is very closely tailored, investment that's very closely tailored on things that bring a guaranteed revenue to the government. And it's kind of nuts that under the old version of the fiscal rules, that stuff was basically like, it was, you couldn't do it, because that is the government crippling itself through some fairly arbitrary rules.
And I guess, Josh, that the government is also signalling that by going down this road, they won't necessarily have to raise taxes.
Well, that's obviously the big question, isn't it? As you rightly point out, that 9 billion isn't a huge amount when you stack it up against all the different things that Andy Burnham is planning to do. So, a national care service for social care is 18 billion a year. Now, that's not going to come in next year, but they are going to have to start planning to spend that money if they really want to do these things. He said that was something he's going to run towards, and he's made it almost a sort of a test of his sincerity in his premiership. So I don't think putting this investment through these finance institutions necessarily gets you out of raising any taxes, but it is probably a way of raising some money in the short term without having to go asking for more around the country.
Absolutely. Well, we'll come back in a minute with our columnists Sonia Soda and Josh Glancy to talk about the issue of early release, but also the decision by the Conservatives to select Joshua Bonehill-Paine as a council candidate. Deal with my excellent columnists Josh Glancy and Sonia Soda. Let's talk about this row over a Conservative council candidate who used to be a neo-Nazi. Joshua Bonehill-Paine has multiple convictions, including for harassing the former MP, now peer Luciana Berger, who is Jewish, for sharing anti-Semitic material online before a planned neo-Nazi rally, and malicious communications over an anti-Islam hoax. Earlier, the Conservative leader Kemi Badenoch spoke to the BBC and defended her party's selection of Bonehill-Paine.
I think what Luciana is talking about is not rehabilitation, but forgiveness. I can understand that she does not want to forgive this man. I might not if I had been his victim. But I'm not giving him a national platform. He is standing to be a councillor in Somerset.
You are giving him a platform, though.
It is a local platform, looking at parking, sorting out bins. That's what councillors do. It's not a national platform.
So, Josh, let's start with you. You can be a former neo-Nazi provided all you're going to be doing is managing the bin collection.
Yeah,
is that a plausible defence?
I didn't think it was a very impressive rationale that Kemi Badenoch gave this morning, because she reached for example, she said, well, Louise Haigh is in the cabinet, so she's been rehabilitated, so why can't Joshua Bonehill-Paine? But I just don't think most people see a sort of phone fraud of the nature that Louise Haigh committed as being in the same category as someone who really committed. I mean, he went to prison. He had reams of pornographic and misogynistic material that he generated, particularly about Luciana Berger. He was virulently anti-Semitic. Now, he has changed. I spoke to Joshua Bonehill-Paine this morning, actually, and was talking to him about, and he has that sort of slightly messianic desire to prove himself that you often hear from with someone who's had a massive epiphany, if you like, a kind of change of direction in life. I think he quite authentically wants to prove that he's changed. But then I also spoke to some quite senior sources in the sort of Jewish leadership community today, and they're quite sceptical. And they don't think they've seen enough evidence yet of what work has been done, what extremism courses has he completed. And it's quite odd to me that Kemi Badenoch would put herself in the position where she's going on the Today programme to defend a guy who is running to be a local councillor in Somerset. I mean, it's quite a sort of low-level position, and yet she's having to defend him in a way that I didn't find entirely convincing. So I think the Tories have sort of stumbled into a slightly unnecessary, it strikes me as a bit of an unforced error at the moment. But I do think I would like to know more, frankly. I'd like to know more about Joshua Bonehill-Paine. I'd like to know more about the journey he's been on. I would like him to be interviewed and to find out whether we can authentically trust this guy's story. But at the moment, it's slightly struck me before we've done that Kemi Badenoch is going out defending him until we know the full story.
I mean, you mentioned Louise Haigh. I mean, the other problem Kemi Badenoch has is that she said when Louise Haigh was in trouble and it led to her resignation that we need more conviction politicians, not more convicted politicians. I mean, talk about a U-turn. Yeah.
There's that, and there's also the fact that people like Gavin Barwell and Grant Shapps and others are now being told that there's no place for them in the to run for an MP and to be a sort of senior figure in the Conservative Party. So she's running so she set herself up for that question. Well, hang on. So you're saying Grant Shapps can't be an MP because he doesn't want to pull out of the ECHR, but this guy Joshua Bonehill-Paine can be a councillor even though he was a neo-Nazi and went to prison, and it's quite an odd. And then she sort of drew this distinction. Well, being an MP is not the same as being as a local councillor, and that's not as important. Well, okay, but it's still a Tory-backed role, and you do deal with lots of important issues in people's everyday lives. So I'm not sure that quite passed muster either.
Yeah, Sonia, there's so much to unpack here. I mean, you're a former Labour advisor. Labour had a huge battle to root anti-Semitism out. Arguably, also, Keir Starmer lost his position as Prime Minister because lots of local councillors lost their seats. So they certainly reminded him that they were important. Is there anything that can defend this choice?
Well, I agree with Josh that we need to know more, but I think it's also particularly important to look at what his victims are saying publicly. And one of them is Baroness Luciana Berger, former Labour MP. This man was convicted of racially aggravated harassment of her. It sounds like his behaviour towards her in court was absolutely despicable. She's described, for example, how he gave a Nazi salute to his followers in court. Now, I'm all for people spending their convictions for really showing true repentance, for looking for forgiveness from victims, for example. But this does all feel a bit preliminary. And for Luciana Berger, who describes what she went through as hell, as having to give evidence in court for 2 days when she was 6 months pregnant, to sort of wake up and find yesterday that this person has been selected to stand as a Conservative councillor, something just isn't quite adding up there. So, yes, I'm all for repentance, forgiveness, but I think his victims have raised real questions about this instance. And I do think that, you know, part of repentance is acknowledging, understanding the impact of behaviour on your victims, and maybe thinking, well, perhaps it's a bit too soon for me to be in public life. Maybe I haven't done the work yet. So it does raise some really serious questions for me.
Yeah, it is really interesting what you say about Luciana Berger, who, you know, I should say is a friend of mine. And, what Kemi Badenoch said was there's a difference between rehabilitation and forgiveness, as it were, and that Luciana is within her rights not to forgive him, but that he can have a route back to rehabilitation. But I guess one of the thoughts that entered my head, Sonia, was, you know, is there a sort of gradation of offences? You know, is there something that one does and you serve your time and you repent, but still makes you not fit for public life? Because, you know, there are some people texting in saying that this man has changed his views, he's rehabilitated, he's now a constructive member of society, let's move on.
Yeah, and I totally accept that people can rehabilitate. Some people, you know, we've got examples, for example, of people who, signed up to the principles of ISIS and became involved in Islamist terrorism, who now do a lot of work to combat that kind of terrorism, working with the Home Office and others. So I'm all for that. But I wouldn't draw the same, you know, very clear distinction between rehabilitation and forgiveness that Kemi Badenoch would. I think part of rehabilitation is understanding fully the impact that what you have done, your actions, your crimes have had on victims, and being willing to run for public office without, you know, having done some of the work to understand that, to understand what impact it might have on your victims. For me, that says perhaps it's too soon.
Well, let's talk about early release. The boss of Thames Valley Police has obviously made it very clear that she thinks the release of the killers of PC Andrew Harper is certainly too soon, and has threatened to take the government to court. The police officer, of course, was killed in Berkshire in 2019, responding to a quad bike theft. The government has announced that certain criminals will be excluded from the early release scheme. People convicted of rape, serious sexual abuse of children, grooming gang offences. But it's ironic that the two men convicted of PC Harper's manslaughter, whose case effectively kicked off this review, look like they will still be freed. I mean, I have a view that obviously they shouldn't be released, but as a commentator, as it were, I also think this is a big, big political problem, Josh, for the government, and they've got to do something about it.
Yeah, it strikes me as the first potential misstep that Burnham and his government has made, in the sense that this has been building for a few weeks, and it's possible they may have to U-turn on it. They may not. I think they could probably style it out, because they are fundamentally letting fewer people out of prison than was originally planned. But it just strikes me, it's one of those classic cases. It's so emotive. As you say, it's almost part of the reason we are where we are is because of this particular case. And this is the kind of seeing around political corners that you really have to do as a government to anticipate some of these problems coming, because it's given a great fillip to Kemi Badenoch and to various sort of right-wing commentators who are understandably very concerned about this. It is very emotive. It will upset the police, and we'll have to see where they go. I don't think the momentum behind it is such that they will have to U-turn, but I think there's a distinct possibility they might, although that does require either recalling Parliament or bringing in a new bill in September when Parliament's back.
I mean, I think, this story's been in the news for 2 or 3 days, and there are these horrible pictures of these criminals being put into a police van and laughing and joking and smiling. So I hear what you say, Josh, about styling it out, and there is an element of me that thinks perhaps that's potential. But I suspect the pictures of them leaving prison, if they do leave prison early, they're not exactly going to behave themselves for the cameras or be thinking about the optics for Andy Burnham, Sonia. So it could be those pictures alone could cause huge damage to the government.
Yeah, absolutely. This is a really difficult issue that I think, to be fair to Andy Burnham, is not a problem of his own making. This is accumulation of, 15 years of failures in prison policy and the failure to build enough prisons, but also the failure to sort of think about sentencing in a more strategic way. Sentencing has gone up a lot in recent years, and that means that we have one of the highest prison populations per head of population in Europe. That said, I think, long sentences are more justified for some sorts of crimes than others. And I'm really talking about where prison is an important feature of public safety, particularly violent men. And, there are a lot of men in our prisons who are violent, convicted of violent assault, of rape, of sexual offences, of murder, of manslaughter. And it is really terrible for victims to be getting these letters. But the government is in between a rock and a hard place, in the sense that if they don't free up some prison places, there are people committing these crimes in the here and now who will be bailed, and they will not be in custody, and there will be no space for them if they get convicted. So that's pretty awful too. I think what I would be looking for from the government in the coming days is more clarity about exactly what crimes have been excluded. I noticed, for example, that Sarah Champion, the Labour MP, has just written to the government asking for more clarity, for example, on domestic abuse perpetrators, on perpetrators of really serious sexual assault that might not be rape, for example. So lots of questions and clarity needed from the government. But to be clear, I do think this is a problem that Andy Burnham has inherited that's not of his own making.
Absolutely. Well, let's move on to other issues that are beginning to emerge on the news agenda. Today, the new guidance on single-sex spaces came into force. It states that trans people should use either gender-neutral facilities or the ones that match their biological sex rather than their gender. The former chair of the Equality and Human Rights Commission, Baroness Faulkner, who oversaw the drafting of the guidance, has said it will be up to women to police the rules themselves, as there isn't enough funding available to enforce the guidance properly. I mean, Sonia, this is a massively controversial area. It's taken, I think, months for this guidance to come out. Does it open up a whole new can of worms, or does it, as it were, set some guidelines that we can all now follow?
It should not open up a new can of worms, in the sense that the guidance accurately states what the law is. We've actually had a High Court. I mean, people are so angry about the HRC daring to state the law in guidance because they're so unhappy with what the law says in terms of the protections it offers women for single-sex facilities and services, that they tried to go to court, take the HRC to court on this. And we've got a High Court judgment that says an earlier iteration of this code of practice was totally legally accurate. So it is the law, it states the law. There are lots of people who don't like the fact that women have protected access to single-sex facilities and services in the law. It's a deeply misogynistic position. It privileges the rights and desires of men who wish to self-identify into those spaces over the rights of women. And so people, institutions, organisations have been trying to flout the law over, I would say the last decade, even when the law was clarified by the Supreme Court in a very, very important judgment last year. There are spaces within the law. There's space within the law for the protection of the dignity of trans people as well. The answer is very, very simple. You operate third spaces, gender-neutral spaces that trans people can use if they feel uncomfortable using, for example, facilities and services that are reserved only for people of their sex. That is a compromise that gender-critical women have argued for years and years and years, and for that we have been told we are hateful, we are transphobic bigots. Well, I have to say, it's absolutely not on. You cannot privilege the desires of a small group of men over the rights of women. That is what some organisations, some charities have been trying to do. And unfortunately, women have been having to go to court in order to enforce their rights, which is extremely expensive. The courts are not always good at the lower level at implementing the law as it stands themselves. So you have to go, you have to appeal, you have to go to the higher courts. So it's a pretty dismal state of affairs, but at least we now have this code of practice operational. There is absolutely no excuse for organisations to break the law when it comes to single-sex facilities and services.
I agree 100% with you on that, Sonia, although Green-led Lambeth has asked officers to advise on the legality of non-implementation. So I was thinking about the politics of this, Josh. They've got the guidance out, but then presumably Andy Burnham and his colleagues will be asked again and again when individual examples of councils not following the law come up. And Labour has historically tied themselves up in knots on this issue.
They have. I think they now have the Supreme Court ruling that they're all able to point to as a kind of get-out clause whenever they're asked about it. I would say just on this issue, I think Sonia's completely right that that sort of third space option is, in a way, is the way to resolve this issue. Unfortunately, it does just logistically, not everywhere has room or facility or money to. Absolutely. It will take a lot of time to implement that. I do feel quite sorry for a lot of trans people who maybe didn't necessarily want to have this fight and were possibly muddling through, but the kind of more radical ideological edge of the movement has basically pushed this and pushed this and pushed this and then lost various court actions, and so we are now having to legislate about it, whereas actually I do almost think we were probably doing better on this issue beforehand, but unfortunately we've ended up in a place where it is...
Because we were muddling through.
Well, that's the British way, isn't it? I'm not saying it was perfect by any means, but...
I think Josh is right in the sense that the issue is that you had charities basically aggressively advising organisations that it was unlawful to protect women's single-sex spaces. So it's very important to say that there are lots of women who would not be comfortable using, for example, a changing room at work if men who identify as female are permitted to use it. But, of course, there may be ways of sort of muddling through at the local level. But the reason why we've needed this clarity in the law, Josh is right, is because of campaigning charities and organisations like Stonewall who've been very aggressive in trying to push for basically the idea that women's boundaries don't count and are unlawful. So it is a massive, massive own goal, and I think it is a very clear example of how not to campaign for rights, because you actually end up, through being overly aggressive by saying that we as a society should ride roughshod over the rights of women, you end up actually harming the interests of the group that you seek to represent. Absolutely.
Well, let's talk now about Josh's away day. He went to Braverman country. He went to Fareham and Waterlooville, just north of Portsmouth. You've written about it because you wanted to kind of, I think, get on the ground in a, inverted commas, reform seat. She won it, of course, as a Conservative, but defected to Reform, to kind of gauge the temperature of, Reform potentially going down in the polls, and what is really happening on the ground. And what did you learn? Yeah,
it's really interesting, right? So if Reform want to be a party of government, then seats like Fareham and Waterlooville need to be well within their reach. It's coastal, it's pretty white, high levels of concern about immigration. Waterlooville's not very affluent, Fareham a bit more affluent. And what I sense is that it's not like the reform vote's collapsing. There's plenty of people who are just in the tank for Farage and will stick with him through thick and thin, and see a lot of the recent scandals and investigations into him as some sort of establishment stitch-up. But I think that the ceiling on reform's aspirations is hardening and calcifying, because to win over various voters in places like Fareham, which is traditionally a Tory seat, they're really struggling. A lot of the people I spoke to just felt quite sceptical about Farage now. Some people even said, oh, well, I would vote reform, except I don't like Farage. You know, for them, he'd almost become a block on voting reform. Others said, oh, I like Nigel, but I'm starting to give Kemi a second look. You know, she's starting to impress me. So it just struck me that, you know, I don't think we should be overblown about the idea that, you know, reform's about to sort of disappear and disintegrate by any means. But I do get the sense that their you know, if we were sitting here 6 months ago or a year ago, we would be saying, well, Nigel Farage is favourite to be the next Prime Minister. I don't think that's not really what the picture looks like anymore. I think it's much more fluid than that. I think Badenoch's still got a real problem with her party's own brand. You know, she's increasingly quite popular. The brand is not. So it's quite a mixed picture on the right. But, I don't think either party is really pulling away from the other one.
Yeah, it's fascinating, isn't it, Sonia? I mean, you know, Andy Burnham is Prime Minister really because the Labour Party decided Keir Starmer couldn't beat reform. You know, the line, I'm the one to stop Nigel Farage becoming Prime Minister. And his elevation has, to a certain extent, coincided with some big self-inflicted goals by reform. So, in that sense, he's perhaps a lucky general?
I think that there's possibly some of that with politics. You know, it's always usually a combination of a multitude of factors. You know, for example, oppositions don't just win general elections, governments lose them. So I think there's probably something similar going on here. I think it's certainly true to say that reform peaked actually well before Keir Starmer resigned in the polls, and it's just that, you know, in the last sort of 2-3 months, things seem to have got kind of progressively more difficult for them in terms of media scrutiny that they are quite rightly receiving over financial donations and problems in the way that they are dealing with that media scrutiny. So absolutely, Andy Burnham is benefiting from that. But also, if we go back to May, for example, and reform's success in the relative success in the local elections, I mean, that shows that Labour had a real issue on its hands. And then you have Andy Burnham running in Makerfield in the by-election, a seat which by all rights was reformed to lose. If you look, you know, just a couple of months earlier at the local election data, actually just a month earlier, and he handsomely wins. So I think it would be unfair not to point to the fact that Burnham is clearly a much, much stronger communicator than Keir Starmer. I think that's one of the reasons why his party decided to replace Keir Starmer with him. So I at the moment, I think it's a bit of both. I think Nigel Farage is screwing up, and I think Andy Burnham is doing quite well. How long those dynamics persist, I think is quite up in the air.
Yeah, I think we all agree on that. It's a very, very fluid situation, and it's very hard to make, I think, a prediction 6 months ahead or even a year ahead as to where the government will be and where the various opposition parties will be. Josh Glancy and Sonia Soda, two great columnists, thank you for coming on the show and talking us through all the issues of the day. This is Ed Vaizey on Time.